Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS, IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. In this lecture, we will look at the issue of labor, precarity and informal work. So, what does it mean, how it is created, and what is the historical significance of this classification. At the same time, we will also look at how precarity, labor and informalization is itself a political process in which, as I had discussed in the previous class, people also organize themselves in groups, in associations which may or may not be equivalent to the old notion of trade unions. So, let us start. In precarity, as we discussed, or informality as we discussed in the previous class, was always understood as part of global south processes or part of third worldism, in which it happens only in the third world. It would never happen in the first world because first world is organized, planned, everybody is living a good life. So, how do we look at them? And then came a situation, particularly in the post 1990s period, in which scholars like Guy Standing have now argued that we are in a situation in which the kind of work that is done in the global south and the livelihoods and life that is being led by different groups of people in the global north, we cannot differentiate between the two. Why is that so? Because unlike in the previous form of capitalism, where we had stable, unionized and Fordist employment opportunities, now it is about informal and flexible labor. These are very fascinating ideas, why? Because when you say flexible labor, the moment or the image that pops up in our heads is this very good looking men and women, mostly lounging around lakes, pools or the sea beaches with their laptops and making money like there is no tomorrow. That is what is the digital nomads, that is what is flexible labor. But the reality is, the moment you associate flexible labor with precarity, the first person that should come to your mind are the delivery workers or so-called delivery executives who deliver food to you. The moment you order some food from the Zomato, Swiggy or Uber Eats, they are part of precarity. Many times they don't even earn more than 10,000 rupees a month. And in the context of India, many a times with that 10,000 rupees they are running their families. The second kind of flexible labor is the ones who are working as plumbers, who are working as carpenters, who are working as your rediwalas. And this kind of work is now not just about global south but across the globe. And most interesting part of this aspect is that if you have ever traveled to any airport, if you have traveled to any the bus depot, if you have traveled by train, look at the Safai Karmacharis there. None of the Safai Karmacharis part of the airport, bus stand or railway station, because all these works have been outsourced to a company which is not paying them the equivalent to what somebody with a proper job in that place would get. And if you are a student, look at your mess staff, a permanent employee there and the ones who have been outsourced. A permanent employee might be getting 50,000 rupees per month, whereas the one who is working there as an outsourced employee might be getting just 10,000 rupees per month. So, this is part of flexibilization process, this is part of contractual processes. And the part of contractual processes started in the 1970s. So, in this lecture, we will discuss how the historical dimensions of changes have brought global north and global south economies together within the idea of neoliberal restructuring. Now, if you conceptualize precarity, precarity is about instability in employment, income and social security. It is a shift from secure to flexible work that is marked by post-forest transformation, and one of the key theorists is Guy Standing, and he is the one who calls the precariat as the dangerous class. In the global south, as we had discussed in the previous class when I had given example of Jan Breman, that the entire agriculture sector was always informal, and as a matter of fact, most of the people who are working in global south, most of the workers in global south are working in the informal sector historically. If it is the 10% in the global north, in India it is close to 90%. Here when we look at informalization or when we look at formalization, it is about working in an establishment which is formally recognized or formally registered with the state. Now, if it is formally registered with the state, let us give an example of Jamshedpur steel plant of Tata's. Say there are 20,000 employees who are working for the Tatas there. In 1950, now this 20,000 workers, out of this 20,000 workers, there is a possibility that 19,000 workers were permanent employees of the Tata steel plant. But in 2015, in 2025, this 20,000 has got reduced to 5,000, and what used to be 1,000 has now become 10,000 employees, because when it is as a matter of fact, this company is registered, right, and they also considered to be some of the best employers in the country. Once you join there, even if it is a private enterprise, you will not be moved out. But what they have done in the name of cost cutting, in the name of subcontractorship as well as entrepreneurship, that we don't want to pay them so much of money, we cannot take care of so many people, because if they are on your regular roles, you have to pay them pension, you have to pay them house, you have to pay for their house, you have to give them healthcare facilities, you have to take care of their family, so on and so forth. So, even if the salary of this one individual is 10,000, the other kind of perks would add up to another 10,000. So, in effect, the moment it is subcontracted, that means you do not have to pay any of those charges. So, you can only pay some 5,000 rupees, and that is the end of the story. Nothing else is required to be given, or if something is to be given, it has to be given at a very minimal kind of support or very minimal perks that are provided. So, that is another reason why in the post 1970s period in the global north and in the post 1990 period in the global south, in the name of restructuring or neoliberal restructuring, flexible labor became a vogue. Another example that I can give you is that of Bangalore and garment factories. So, Bangalore has one of the largest number of garment factories in the country, and most of these garment factories employ women, and most of these women are not directly under the payroll of the companies. What do I mean here? What I mean is that these garment factories are producing garments for across the board. So, there is a possibility that in the market sphere, Levi's, in the market sphere, Wrangler and Calvin Klein, all three of them are competitors. But very interestingly, there is a possibility that the same woman who is working in a particular factory in Bangalore is creating the material, is creating the clothes for all three of them. It's only at the end that somebody is putting a tag and then classifying them accordingly. So, what does that mean? It means that work is being done, but a lot of this work is hidden from labor laws as well as from production costs. Why women? Because women do not question. Women are always replaceable, and men can come together and fight for their rights, but women would not, because they have a thousand of other things to take care of, and whatever money they are getting from this place is going to help the running of their families. Now, there is another interesting aspect of this story. The interesting aspect is that if you look at Bangalore as the square shaped the city, or as a circle, these garment factories are located at different zones, different places in Bangalore. They are not located at one site. So, if they are located in different places, that means all these employees, all these workers can never know each other. If they are not able to know each other, that means to organize them is next to impossible. The distance between this fellow and this fellow could be almost like 50 kilometers. How will they come to organize themselves unless and until they know each other? So, in that sense, what we see here is that informalization can be part of formal processes, formal enterprises, but we also have to look at the global value chains and how these global value chains are creating informalization, so that more and more surplus can be generated for the companies who are subcontracting their works, who are outsourcing their works. So, informalization is not a failure, but a deliberate capitalist strategy. So, the formal informal duality that we had discussed in the previous class can be summed up in this one sentence, that informalization is not because there is no formal work available, rather it is because capitalism is going to function like that, because capitalism is not here for charity. Rather, capitalism functions on something called surplus, and surplus is in the more general language it is called profit. The more profit you have, the better resources you can have to pay your CEOs. May not be to the employees of these garment factories or these small places, but to your CEOs and to your executives. Otherwise, how do you think this globalization and capitalist entrepreneurship and capitalism would reproduce itself in this scenario? So, informal economies, that is why, is now a global phenomena in which close to 60% of people work in one way or the other. In the global south, it can exceed more than 85%, and as I said, if you are looking at regulations in terms of formal and informal, in South Asia, particularly in India, it can go to more than 90%. And how do you reconcile when 90% of the people are working in the informal sector? So, there is another side of the story in which the rest 10% are called as labor aristocrats. The labor aristocrats are the ones who have job tenure, security of this job tenure, they have pension schemes of different types, they have housing schemes for different types. They are the ones who enjoy lives. They are the ones who can afford to send their children to fancy schools or even decent schools, as well as they are the ones who are working it out to reproduce this aristocracy. In the context of India, they are the central government employees, they are the state government employees, and they are in military, they are in police, and they are in different other spaces. So when you look at, or when I say government services, don't exclude military and police from the government services, because that is where a great deal of labor aristocracy comes from. Your soldier is also a labor, may not be your labor, but he or she is the labor for the state, and they have to be paid. And if they have to be paid, there is a certain formal association that is created for the payment structures. You might have heard about something called the pay commissions, the 5th pay commission, 6th pay commission, 7th pay commission, 8th pay commission, and one of the greatest divisions happens there, wherein there is a fight or there is a negotiation, in a more politically correct language if I say, between the bureaucrats in civil services and the military bureaucrats in military services, in which the military would like to get more salary, more perks from every commission, whereas the babus and civil servants would always try to enhance it for themselves. So recently it's going to happen. So watch out for the news. What kind of negotiation is happening there? And it is happening within this 10%. Nobody cares about this 90% as of now, because this 90% will get certain doles if something is happening, but they will remain in precarious positions. Nothing much is going to happen to them in terms of state providing certain securities or state providing something others. But because we are democracy, so they do get some services from the state. For example, you have those medical cards in which you get 5 lakh rupees. So that is part of providing something for the informal labor. You get labor cards, you get ration cards, so that some of the social security measures that are given by the state can reach you. But if you go and do empirical studies, or if you go through empirical research, you will find that many of the same kind of cards are also funneled to this 10%, because this labor aristocracy is also well connected and they can get any card they want to. So they have everything that you see is not here. The informal sector labor doesn't have contracts or stable contracts. The labor aristocrats have stable contracts. There is no legal protection for the informal laborers. There is legal protection for the labor aristocrats. But this is not, through this I am not trying to create a binary between the two, because at the end of the day they are laborers. The people who are the labor aristocrats today could lose out their jobs and become part of the informal sector, or once they retire from that position, then there is a possibility that the position itself will vanish, and anybody who is getting recruited to that position will always remain within certain contractual frameworks. Let us again look at the political economy of domestic workers or home based producers. How are they perceived? If they are domestic workers, most often than not they are women. If they are home based producers, most often than not they are women. And as I said, women usually don't have many rights because their work itself is not considered to be important. And if their works are not considered to be so significant or so important, that means we can call them as domestic workers or home based producers. So this way what we see is that the informal labor is not just only an issue of poverty, it's not just an issue of politics, it's not just an issue of formal informal duality, but it is also an issue of gender. Why certain genders are privileged over others, and why somebody's work are not valued as much as others. So we need to understand this historical as well as social factors that are determining the political economy and political sociology of labor force as well as labor dynamics. So informal labor within the foundation of neoliberal globalization is usually the hidden, and we don't understand generally the role of women in the reproduction of families, in the reproduction of capitalism and the reproduction of societies, as well as the people coming from severely marginalized classes and castes who are the willing to work on subsistence wages. So another aspect of informal labor in the global south is that most of this 90% come from backward castes, come from Dalit and Adivasi communities. I'm not saying all 90% of them come from these communities, but a majority of them they do. So it is also a social aspect of marginalization, social aspect of inequality and discrimination, because of which most of these individuals and groups are part of this informal labor economy. And as I said about gender and precarity, precarity is profoundly gendered and racialized because women don't always get paid the same amount as that of the men. Maria Mies, way back in the 1980s, wrote a very fascinating book. It's called The Lace Makers of Narsapur. She's giving the example, an ethnographic documentation of the coastal Andhra Pradesh, in which she is documenting these women who themselves do not consider their work to be work, and they are these women who create the most intricate the lace materials, and most of these lace materials are exported to the global north, to Europe, to America, to Canada, so on and so forth. But because they are not aware that their work is work, because they are doing it in their leisure time at home, so they also don't get paid properly. There is no insurance for their work, and when it is about home based work, that means you don't even know how much time you are spending. Only a few years back we came out of COVID, and you might be aware as to how much work people used to do during the COVID time. When you go to an office or go to a factory, you work for 8 hours. But when you are working from home, it usually becomes 16 hours because work never ends. So this kind of patriarchal framing naturalizes women's labor as supplementary or leisurely work. Even if their products are sold in the market for thousands of rupees, but the valuation that is attached to women and their labor is not given as much importance. So apart from the gender, even the migrant workers have the same problem, because they face extreme levels of vulnerability due to many issues. They don't know the people who are living there. Many a times they don't know the language in case this is international migration. Many a times their passports are taken away. For example, when Asian migrants go to the Gulf countries, particularly as household help or as construction workers, the passports are taken away by their employees. And when they take away their passports, that means they are entirely dependent on the well-being. And the worst part of it is that we cannot, or we are not willing to do anything about it. So what we need to understand here is that when you look at precarity, we need to look at it in terms of intersectionalities of caste, gender, race, migration, which shapes class politics, and many times which doesn't even shape class politics, because as I said, they could be fragmented in different locations, and when they are fragmented and in an international level, if their passports have been taken, and even if they want to try to do something, they cannot do, they cannot even come back to their respective countries. So because this is happening now to people in the global north as well as global south, that is another reason why even the scholars in global north, in the developed industrialized countries, they are so fascinated to work on their own societies regarding this. It's also because the academicians and researchers who are working in this in their respective institutions, they are now feeling the pinch, because many of their colleagues themselves have become part of outsourced groups. So if there is a professor who is working in a particular, maybe let us say at Harvard University, there is a possibility that person's colleague is a contractual faculty who doesn't have a tenure there. So he or she can be fired at will. So this professor is a privileged one now. So what used to be a matter of right to get a job has now become privilege. So how do you look at these privileges is very interesting within this framework. But as I said in the previous class also, that anytime there is informality, anytime there is suppression of labor, laborers are going to, if not today, maybe tomorrow, if not in a grand scale, maybe at a smaller level, they are going to organize themselves and then demand certain rights. So in the next class, we'll discuss more about it and how different scholars have tried to understand these organizing processes and the demands of different kind of groups. Suffice it to say that whether it is in Latin America, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in India, we see informal workers movements framing their ideas, framing their discourses in order to achieve their agency, as well as in terms of their citizenship rights, their urban rights, as well as their human rights. Seva is a prime example in which Ela Bhatt way back in the 1970s organized a woman in the name of Self-Employed Women's Association, and it pioneered the cooperative models of work, in which through cooperatives they organized not only their work, their savings, bank aspects, as well as what kind of work they are going to do, what kind of tenure they are going to have, and what kind of social security they are going to have. So this became a role model, or Seva became a role model for many other activists in order to organize informal workers. But unlike the middle class, unlike the formal sector workers, most often than not, informal workers are emphasized, or the movements are emphasized in terms of community rather than workplace. It could be for healthcare, it could be for housing, it could be for child care. And usually the negotiating factors are cooperatives, NGOs and certain associations, but mostly they are NGOs, because trade unions are now representing most of the unionized employees rather than that of the informal sector workers. But what these informal sector workers also do is that rather than demanding whatever they required in terms of labor rights, they demand it in terms of citizen rights. So they do not ask whatever they want from their employers, rather they demand them from the state in terms of subsidized ration, in terms of education, in terms of housing, in terms of water facilities, in terms of the social security, so on and so forth. And the capitalists are very happy with it, primarily because they don't have to pay. It's the state who is paying. If you remember our discussion on Partha Chatterjee, in which we had discussed about political society and civil society, how did he describe political society? Political society is the group where informal workers live. So they demand from the state, they demand from the municipal corporations, they demand from others, but not much from their contractors or their employers. Because of which now we have a number of acts that have been created by Government of India, and this is true across nations, to safeguard street vendors, to safeguard the other kind of workers. But the difference between the capitalist class, CIS, and that of the informal workers is that this is always localized. When I say localized, that means there would be one for the street vendors, another one for people who are working in more organized spaces, or people who are working in the household level. It's not about a holistic group of people in which everybody across the board is getting it. Women may or may not get anything in terms of being women. If they are part of street vending, yes, they will get it something, but not much. So the political representation is again done through the mediators, through the International Labour Organization or United Nations or NGOs, or in the case of India's SEVA and domestic workers unions. But most often than not, this political representation is in a piecemeal approach, which essentially means that they would like certain conditions to be fulfilled, but mostly they are not long term solutions. So even if the government of India is providing a 1 rupee rice and 1 rupee wheat to some of these workers who are working in the informal sector, this is not bringing any change in the structure itself. That why is it that even though some of these people are doing multiple jobs per day or per week or per month, still they cannot get a subsistence wage, to an extent that the state has to provide them 1 rupee the kg rice or 1 rupee kg the wheat or other kind of rationed items. That means there is something essentially wrong with the structure of our economy itself, or the understanding of this economy itself. So what we get to see here, if you use the language of Partha Chatterjee, is that through the democratization process, the state is only managing the after effects of primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession, to use David Harvey's concept, rather than bringing in a structural change to empower their precarious lives or to bring them out of precarity. So as I have been saying, so there are different perspectives that have come up from different locations in the global south. You can go through it. I have listed most of these works in the references and further readings. So there are some of the questions that we have. How does the precariat form a new class or a part of the broader working classes, and how Guy Standing and its critique and his critique would like to look at it. So, and how can we look at class itself through everyday life, gender and informality. So in essence, informal movements illuminate new horizons for justice and inclusive urban futures, and it is happening through the formation of precarious solidarities. But even if there are precarious solidarities, we have to be very conscious what kind of solidarities are being made rather than romanticizing them. We have to see in historical moment, historical periodization, how they are being organized, to what extent they are being successful, to where they are being successful, and to what degree they are being successful or they are not being successful. So these are the further readings. You can go through them. They are very interesting readings, and they will help you in understanding these aspects further. Thank you.